Canada is well known for the very successful integration policy because they have managed to implement multiculturalism as the official policy that the people of Canada has protected. But despite this success, a range of problems are connected to multiculturalism as a policy.
In 1971, the Liberal Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau introduced the term multiculturalism and bilingualism. It was at that time the thought of acknowledging other cultures and ethnicities was brought up. In 1977, a number of human rights laws were established. In 1988, the Canadian Multiculturalism Act was adopted and made the official policy of Canada. That made Canada the first country in the world with a policy mainly based on multiculturalism. It worked as a guideline to the people and told them to acknowledge the minorities and their cultures, also First Nations. It is the government's job to make sure that every Canadian should be able to get a job, to respect the diversity among the Canadian population, and to take advantage of it, and at last to implement French and English as the two official languages, but that other languages should be respected. And in 1991, the Canadian Broadcasting Act was added to the list of laws concerning multiculturalism. It stated that the Canadian TV and radio was now obligated to reflect the diversity in society. The media had to consider the identity and interests of not only the majority of Canadians, but also the many minority groups in the Canadian society. Today, Canada receives 250,000 immigrants every year, and the majority of them are economic immigrants who seek to work, education, and opportunities of a better life. The foundation of the Canadian society depends on immigrants, and therefore one can assume that Canada will continue to receive the same amount of immigrants in the future.
Today, the expression multiculturalism have two meanings, an ideological one and a pluralistic one. Many people have criticized the last and ideological definition of the term because multiculturalism in that version allows groups of people to have an exceptional set of rights. These rights sometimes differ from the overall laws, and therefore certain cultural groups are not held responsible for certain actions. The other explanation says that a multicultural society is one that contains people of different cultural backgrounds. This description fits very well with the vision behind Trudeau's ideas of a well-functioning, diverse Canadian society. Unfortunately, a negative discourse has been shaped around the term multiculturalism, partly because some has proclaimed the ideological version of the word to be non-existent, impossible, unfair, or dead. Because of these accusations against multiculturalism, the term interculturalism has been argued to represent the Canadian society way better. Interculturalism describes a society in which different cultural groups gets to practice their traditions and cultures, but on some level adapt to the majority in order to create some shared interests, identities, and values within society. Interculturalism can be seen as a bowl of salad with all kinds of different ingredients which are tied together by the dressing that is their national identity and shared values. Multiculturalism is more of a mosaic of different cultures living side by side without mingling.
Many Canadians have hyphenated identities, which is seen to be the golden middle way between assimilation and segregation. For the Canadian society, hyphenated identity is what they strive for because the immigrants adapt to the Canadian society while still keeping most of their traditional values. But it can cause identity crisis for the people living in the hyphen. In the story Everyone Talk Loudly in Chinatown, the main character is a young girl of Chinese heritage who goes to a Canadian school and has a Canadian boyfriend but has trouble juggling the two different worlds. At home she has to act traditionally Chinese, even though she identifies with the values of her Canadian friends more. There's also a fear of the Canadians' multiculturalism leading to segregation because the huge focus on different cultures can end up with people getting caught up in their own cultural background. You see that Canada, just like many countries all over the world, has Chinatowns, Little Italys, and so on, which shows that multiculturalism doesn't break the ghettoization and segregation between different cultures.
In the year 2003, the Canadian government decided to revise the entire school system after many years with Canada laying below the global average. Both the school and the teaching profession were in a regular crisis. They did this by setting up 3 clear goals for the school to obtain. They wanted to improve the students' result to reduce the gap between people from different groups and ethnicities, and by that break down the social heritage, and in the end they wanted to increase the population's trust in the public schools, for example by educating top-class teachers. After these ranges of measures, the Canadian school is now a great example to other countries around the world because of their ability to lift up weak students, especially the First Nations and immigrants. But because of this success story, it doesn't mean that it is and has been an easy time for especially the First Nations to go to school. In their own society, they have a whole different way to look at life and learning. For example, with the narrator in the story, for every North American Indian who begins to disappear, I also begins to disappear, tells that they always have learned things by observing and by putting things into a bigger perspective, but that it is completely different outside these societies where they going to school. They also have to manage to switch between different languages depending on where they were. For not long time ago, the Prime Minister was out in public to give an apology to all the First Nations that had been victims to the white man's conditions. And in continuation of that, a First Nation was out to tell that the terror not just was mental, but also physical by way of sexual harassment. Discrimination is amongst the consequences of the current Canadian society. Research has shown that relatively new immigrants with previous work experience and education earns almost half of what ethnic Canadians earn. Despite the lack of a set minimum wage being an attempt at improving integration on the Canadian workplace, this might have had negative impact in terms of enabling discrimination and create ghettoization. This factor can be extremely demotivating when it comes to kids and newer immigrants, as most of Canada's immigrants are economic immigrants. The discrimination is shown in another form in the short story Tamil Lane, where a couple of Mounties violate the rights of an Indian chef, presumably under the assumption that he's an illegal immigrant, and treat him as such despite him having Canadian citizenship. In the same story, it is told that one of the characters has been pushed out in front of a train and now suffers permanent physical disabilities. The discrimination in general is also pictured in the short story A Wedding in Toronto, when the white Canadian girl Agatha married the black West Indian Henry and none of her family members shows up at the wedding, and when the white people in the neighborhood shout terms of abuse at them while they're leaving the party.
A charter incorporated into the Canadian immigration policy and courts ensures that the rights of minorities and immigrants are protected, especially when it comes to freedom of religion by stating sentences for guidance. This ultimately leads the judge to interpret various laws and rights. However, when a minority succeeds, it can force the majority to adapt to the wishes of the minority in question. This can lead to new issues, as there are no clear lines or laws. In some cases, the rights of a minority might clash with human rights, and the minority can gain rights that the majority could never gain access to. When a Sikh boy was allowed to bring a ceremonial dagger to school, it sparked a lot of interest and much controversy. Ensuring the rights of minorities is, of course, a vital part of democracy, but the Charter leaves the definition of said rights up for discussion. This leaves the job of balancing between the rights of minorities and basic fundamental and human rights up to the individual judges. Yet some minorities struggle to get recognized, which causes the judges to dismiss them, as the Charter does not cover them. So even though the Charter was established to ensure the rights of minorities, it can, in some cases, lead to more dismissal of others.
The Canadians are known to have a positive discourse towards immigrants, which is crucial for the successful integration of immigrants in Canada. But a threat to this positive discourse is the number of fugitives who come to Canada seeking asylum, who, when they have been granted Canadian citizenship, return to their country of origin knowing they can flee to Canada if needed. For example, in 2006, 40,000 Canadian citizens were in Lebanon during the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, demanding help from Canada. Most of them had returned to Lebanon less than 6 weeks later. The Canadian refugee laws are in some people's eyes seen to be too loose. In 2003, the Canadian approval rate for asylum seekers was almost 50%, which means that the rules as to whether refugees are in danger in their countries of origin or not are looser than most countries. This creates a risk of exploitation. For example, in 1996, 8,600 Sri Lankans with pending refugee claims in Canada filed for travel documents to go visit family in the country they sought to flee from. A part of these refugees were granted Canadian citizenship. Here are 2 suggestions as to how Canada can deal with multiculturalism in the future. One way to solve the problems associated with Canadian multiculturalism is making the Canadian society less multicultural and more intercultural. This means to create a broader foundation of shared values and to force the immigrants to learn one of the 2 official languages. This will help create a stronger national identity.
While countries such as Canada can absorb a reasonable amount of immigrants and with very different cultural traditions and backgrounds, Canada is not in need of such a huge inflow. Instead of taking in a large number of immigrants and hereby putting pressure on the educational system and public health care, Canada could instead focus on bettering the existing workforce training programs and the integration of newcomers in general. That way, Canada could gain more well-integrated members of society while avoiding unnecessary pressure on the system.
Because of Canada's continuing dependence on immigrants, a need for revision of multiculturalism as a policy will soon arise.